He cried and cried while the house looked the other way. A nanny saves baby. A false accusation explodes into a rich family scandal. And one choice could become a viral rescue story that changes everything. Stay until the end, tell us. Would you forgive someone who saved your child? The sound of a baby's cry filled the halls of a mansion where silence was usually a sign of control and wealth. The walls were tall, the floors polished, the portraits smiling down with cold perfection, but nothing inside those rooms could soften the sharp wail of a child who had been ignored for hours. The bottle left in the crib was sour, the milk turned, the smell spreading faintly like a warning no one wanted to notice. Downstairs, Myra kept wiping the same polished floor, her hands raw from bleach and her body heavy with exhaustion. She had been hired to clean corners no one saw, to make a house gleam in places where no one looked, yet even through the smell of lemon cleaner and dust, she heard the child's cries. She paused, mop in hand, listening. Every sound of desperation pulled at something hidden inside her, a memory buried but never gone. Her own child had died months ago, a loss that left her body restless and her arms aching as though still waiting to hold someone. She lived with that emptiness every day, folding it away like a secret. Now, hearing the cries from upstairs, she felt the wound tear open again. Without hesitation, Mara climbed the grand staircase, her bare feet whispering against the marble. The nursery was filled with soft light, filtered through gauzy curtains. The child's face was red and slick with sweat, fists trembling in the air, chest heaving as if the small lungs were close to breaking. The bottle, abandoned and spoiled, sat untouched on the table. Myra picked it up, sniffed the milk, and recoiled. Sour, dangerous, a neglect that spoke louder than words. She looked down at the infant. The crying slowed as the child turned its head instinctively toward her chest. Myra's hands shook, torn between fear of consequence and the instinct of a mother. Her body remembered what her heart had lost. Slowly, carefully, she lifted the baby and cradled him against her breast. In that moment, the wailing stopped, replaced by quiet, rhythmic breaths. The tension in his tiny body released as he fed, and for the first time in hours, the mansion was still. At that same moment, Ethan was in his office, high above the city skyline, closing a deal worth millions. His world revolved around signatures, contracts, and numbers that never cried. The muffled sound of his child's suffering barely registered through the thick door. Yet when he finally opened it, stepping into the nursery, the sight before him was unlike anything he had imagined. The woman he had hired only to clean the corners of his world was now holding his son with a tenderness that unsettled him. He saw Myra nursing, the baby calm, eyes closed in fragile peace. Ethan froze, caught between shock and something he could not name. For a fleeting instant, he felt a memory rush back, the image of his late wife holding the child in the same position before illness had taken her away. But the moment shattered quickly. Ethan's mind turned not to gratitude but to appearances. What if someone saw this? What would people whisper? His life was built on reputation, and rumors spread faster than truth. Already, whispers had begun among the neighbors. Someone had seen Myra through the half-open curtain. By the time Ethan entered the room, the scandal had already been born. Myra looked up, startled, her eyes wide with the fear of being misunderstood. She tried to explain, her voice steady but broken at the edges. The bottle was spoiled, she said. The baby was burning with fever. She had done what was necessary to keep him alive. There was no shame in her tone, only an exhausted honesty, but Ethan heard only the echoes of judgment he imagined from others. His decision came swiftly, cold as a contract. She was to leave the next morning. No discussion. No chance to defend herself. Pack your things. Do not return. his words cut like a gavel striking wood, final and merciless. The baby whimpered as Mara placed him gently back in the crib. She smoothed the blanket, kissed his forehead, and stood in silence. She did not argue. She did not beg. Some losses, she already knew, had no argument strong enough to reverse them. Rain poured as she left the mansion that night, her few belongings folded into a small plastic bag. The streetlight glistened on her wet hair as she walked without direction, every step heavier than the last. Behind her, the house of marble and glass stood silent, pretending it had not cast her out. She found a bench beneath a flickering lamp and sat there, shivering in the cold. People passed, glancing at her briefly before turning away. A woman muttered, "She'll get by." A man tossed a coin near her feet, as though pity could replace justice. Mara pulled her coat tighter around her body and closed her eyes, listening not to the city, but to the phantom cries of the child. The morning sunlight filters through the grand windows of the mansion, casting long shadows on the polished floors. Lorna carefully lays Miguel on the living room rug, gently brushing the soft curls from his forehead. He giggles, reaching for a bright toy, and she laughs quietly, relieved at his growing strength. Gabriel watches from the kitchen doorway, the weight of his guilt still pressing against his chest. He wants to speak, to say something that would ease the tension between them, but the words get caught in his throat. Today marks 2 weeks since Lorna returned, and every gesture of care she gives to Miguel is a quiet reminder of her selfless courage. The neighbors' whispers and the gossip still linger in the air like invisible chains, but Gabriel has made a choice. He will no longer let their judgments dictate the life inside his home. He pours himself a cup of coffee and glances at the baby, noticing the small smile playing on Miguel's lips. Lorna hums a gentle tune, and the boy claps his hands in delight. The room feels alive with warmth and tentative peace. Gabriel steps closer, clearing his throat. She looks up, eyes wary but attentive. "Do you need help?" he asks softly. "No," she replies, a hint of steel in her voice. "I've got this. I'm not going to ask for help unless I need it." Gabriel nods, silently admiring her strength. The faint sound of the phone buzzing on the side table breaks the morning calm. Gabriel answers. It's one of the few neighbors who has kept tabs on their household. Marcia's voice is cautious, almost skeptical. "Gabriel, are you sure bringing Lorna back was the right choice?" He listens quietly, holding the line, the weight of her scrutiny pressing against his resolve. "I am sure," he finally says, firm. "She saved my son, that's all that matters." The conversation ends, leaving him with a lingering sense of satisfaction and lingering tension. The world outside may judge, but inside, Lorna's presence has begun to heal the cracks left by fear and misunderstanding. By noon, Lorna prepares a simple lunch, setting it on the dining table with careful attention. Miguel sits in his high chair, swinging his legs and babbling animatedly. Gabriel sits opposite them, observing the subtle harmony forming in the household. He remembers the first moments after finding Lorna under the viaduct, how frail she looked, how vulnerable. Now she is a pillar of care, radiating patience and quiet authority. Gabriel wonders how he could have doubted her, how the venom of lies could have clouded his judgment. The words family, trust, and forgiveness echo in his mind, forming the invisible pillars upon which their fragile household begins to rebuild itself. Later in the afternoon, a knock at the door interrupts their quiet rhythm. Gabriel opens it to find Teresa and Carmen, two neighbors who have been particularly vocal in their criticism. They enter, expressions sharp, hands clasped tightly, their voices a mix of concern and accusation. Lorna remains in the living room, holding Miguel, calm yet wary. Gabriel steps forward. "What is it this time?" he asks. Teresa speaks first, careful but pointed. "We just want to ensure that everything is safe, that your son is well cared for." Gabriel's jaw tightens. "Lorna has been caring for Miguel with everything she has. If your concern is genuine, watch, listen, and see for yourselves." Carmen fidgets, clearly uncomfortable as they observe the interaction between mother and child. Miguel giggles, reaching for Lorna's hand, tugging gently. She smiles, leaning down to meet his gaze. Gabriel watches closely, a mixture of relief and pride washing over him. Lorna's patience, her love, and her unwavering attention speak louder than any gossip ever could. The women leave, voices quieter, their skepticism diminished by what they've just witnessed. Gabriel exhales, feeling a sense of quiet victory. The approval he seeks is not theirs. It's in the health, happiness, and laughter of his son. As the sun dips lower, casting a warm glow through the tall windows, Lorna prepares Miguel for his afternoon nap. Gabriel assists quietly, adjusting the blanket, brushing hair from the child's forehead, feeling a connection growing between father and son. Lorna glances at him, a soft acknowledgement passing between them, a silent truce built on shared responsibility and mutual care. The household feels settled, though the scars of past misunderstandings linger. They sit together for a moment, watching Miguel sleep peacefully, the sound of his gentle breathing filling the room. Gabriel reflects on his failures, on the lessons learned too late, but also on the opportunities that lie ahead to be present, patient, and truly supportive. Later, Gabriel makes a small but deliberate change. He calls the pediatrician and arranges regular home visits, ensuring that Miguel's growth continues under professional guidance. Lorna watches, a subtle smirk crossing her face. "You don't have to do that," she says. He shrugs, knowing that gestures of support, even small ones, signal a commitment to doing right, to making amends not just through words but through consistent action. The house feels alive, filled with hope, laughter, and quiet determination. As evening falls, Lorna tucks Miguel into bed, reading a story softly, her voice a gentle lullaby that fills the space with warmth and reassurance. Gabriel leans against the doorframe, silently absorbing the moment. The faint glow of the lamp casts long shadows, reflecting the delicate balance of emotions in the room. Trust is being rebuilt slowly, moment by moment, through actions, through care, through the unwavering presence of someone who has chosen to stay, despite past betrayals. Gabriel realizes that forgiveness, patience, and time are the threads weaving their new family fabric together. One day, one smile, one shared responsibility at a time. By nightfall, the mansion settles into a tranquil quiet. The distant city sounds fade, leaving only the occasional rustle of leaves and the soft breathing of a child. Gabriel writes a private note, acknowledging his growth, his mistakes, and his commitment to trust Lorna completely. The house is no longer just a place of wealth or status. It is a home defined by care, courage, and the delicate rebuilding of fractured bonds. He steps away from the note, letting it rest on the desk, a silent promise to himself and to Lorna. Outside, the stars begin to emerge, tiny points of light over the grand estate, mirroring the quiet hope blossoming within these walls. The foundation of their reconstructed family is fragile, yes, but it is genuine, rooted in love, responsibility, and the shared devotion to Miguel. And as he watches Lorna and Miguel together, Gabriel knows that the journey has only just begun. The mansion, once filled with the sounds of luxury dinners and elite gatherings, now carried an unusual silence that echoed through its halls. The maid walked softly across the polished marble floor, her worn shoes making faint sounds against the cold surface. The millionaire watched from a distance, conflicted, as his child reached out only for her arms, clinging to her with a trust that cut deeper than any words. The family drama was no longer hidden behind walls of wealth. It was exposed, raw, impossible to ignore. This was not just about survival anymore. It was about redemption, betrayal, and the fragile hope of forgiveness. If you believe this story deserves to be told and that truth should always come before judgment, don't forget to like this video and subscribe. Your support helps us share more powerful stories like this one. The mornings became a routine, though far from peaceful. The maid woke early, preparing simple meals, always focusing on the baby's health. She measured every spoon carefully, ensuring the child regained weight. The millionaire, though present at the table, often remained silent, his eyes studying her every move. He wanted to speak, to bridge the distance, but the memory of his betrayal lingered, creating an invisible wall between them. The social contrast was no longer about money, it was about trust. He had wealth but no peace. She had nothing, yet carried the strength to heal a broken home. One afternoon, sunlight poured through the tall glass windows, highlighting the grand living room. The maid sat on the carpet, playing with the child. Her laughter filled the air, soft but genuine, while the baby clapped his hands in delight. The millionaire stood by the doorway, watching silently. For the first time in months, the mansion felt alive, touched by warmth instead of loneliness. Yet he also knew the neighborhood whispers would not stop. In their world of perfection, redemption was rarely welcomed. As the days passed, tension grew between appearances and reality. The maid insisted on humility, refusing the luxury of the guest suite and returning to her modest quarters at the back of the house. She did not want comfort. She wanted respect. Every corner of the mansion reminded her of sacrifice, of pain, of betrayal that almost cost a child his life. She refused to let herself be seen as a guest in a palace she had once been thrown out of like trash. Midway through those weeks, the first challenge arrived. The millionaire's closest neighbors, 3 women known for their sharp tongues and sharper opinions, knocked at the door. Their expressions carried the weight of judgment. They stepped into the living room with the authority of social gatekeepers, their gazes fixed on the maid as if she were a stain on the carpet. They whispered accusations, carefully veiled but impossible to ignore. How could he, a man of stature, allow a poor maid to return? How could he forgive her after all the suspicions and rumors? Was he blinded by guilt, or worse, by her presence? The millionaire, for the first time, stood tall before them. His voice carried a conviction that even surprised him. He defended the maid, exposing the lies of betrayal that had poisoned his judgment before. He admitted publicly that she had saved his child when no one else could. That moment was not just for the neighbors. It was for himself, a step toward redemption that would not be undone. Still, the whispers would spread. In their world, a shocking twist always found new ways to crawl back into conversations. Later that night, the maid walked into the nursery and found the millionaire sitting quietly by the crib, the child sleeping peacefully. Their eyes met. No words were spoken, but the silence was heavier than any scream. She knew he was still battling doubt. He knew she still carried scars of humiliation. Yet in that fragile moment, there was something else. A possibility of forgiveness, not given freely, but earned through persistence and truth. Halfway through this story, let me remind you, if you want to see how this maid's survival and strength transform an entire family, subscribe now and share this video. Your support helps keep stories like this alive. Days turned into weeks, and soon an unexpected call disturbed the fragile peace. A voice from the maid's past returned, the ex-husband, a man who thrived on manipulation. He spoke of lost children, of tragedy painted with lies, attempting to twist her survival into shame. The millionaire listened in silence, doubt gnawing at him again. Was betrayal truly behind them, or was another twist about to unfold? The maid, when confronted, stood firm. Her face burned with anger, but her voice carried truth. She explained the loss, the pain, and the injustice of being blamed for tragedies she never caused. The millionaire struggled between doubt and belief, between shadows of the past and the fragile trust being rebuilt in the present. This was the true battle, not money, not status, but the power to choose trust over suspicion. The child, unaware of the storm, continued to grow stronger each day. His laughter became louder, his steps more confident. He was the anchor holding them together. Every smile he gave the maid was proof of her sacrifice. Every hug he offered the millionaire was proof of a chance for redemption. The family drama, once broken, was slowly stitching itself into something new, not perfect, but real. By the end of this chapter, the mansion no longer felt empty. It echoed with new beginnings, fragile yet powerful. And as the maid closed the nursery door, the millionaire whispered to himself words he wasn't ready to share aloud. Forgiveness was not a gift he deserved, but perhaps one day it would be his. And now I ask you, if you were in this millionaire's place, would you forgive and allow redemption? Or would betrayal always live in your memory? Tell me in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video so we can continue this journey together. The mansion stood still in the waning light of the afternoon, its vast windows reflecting the pale hue of a sky that promised rain. Inside, silence reigned, broken only by the faint ticking of an ornate golden clock perched on the mantelpiece. The maid moved slowly across the gleaming marble floor, her hands reddened and cracked from hours of scrubbing with harsh cleaning chemicals. She felt every bone in her back ache as she straightened up, her breath short from bending too long. Around her, the richness of the space seemed to mock her exhaustion. Crystal chandeliers sparkled above her, velvet curtains swayed slightly with the draft, and priceless oil paintings observed her like silent judges. It was a kingdom of wealth and power, yet none of it belonged to her. Every day she touched these walls, polished the surfaces, and arranged the treasures, only to leave without leaving any trace of her presence. The millionaire sat in his high-backed leather chair, a figure carved out of shadow and light, observing her every move. His suit was as precise as his demeanor, perfectly tailored and glistening faintly under the amber glow of the lamps. Even the gold cufflinks on his wrists seemed alive with light, catching her gaze for a fleeting second. Embarrassed, she lowered her eyes and continued wiping the base of a sculpture. Her worn shoes squeaked faintly on the polished surface, a tiny sound amplified by the cavernous stillness. In her mind, she rehearsed the tasks still waiting, polishing the stair rail, dusting the library, arranging the silverware. Each job felt endless, yet necessary, because invisibility was her shield in this house. When his voice finally broke the silence, it carried the weight of command and curiosity alike. He asked about her family, her past, her struggles, questions that startled her more than a sharp order ever could. No man of his stature had shown interest in the fragile world she carried silently. At first, she hesitated, her lips pressing tightly as though guarding secrets no one was meant to hear. But something in his tone, firm yet softened by a strange undercurrent, nudged her to answer. She spoke cautiously, each word carved out of memory. Of nights when she went without food to keep her younger siblings fed, of bills that piled up like mountains, of dreams she had long buried beneath duty and sacrifice. Her words echoed faintly against the marble walls, her reflection shimmering faintly in the glass frame of a massive painting behind him. She stood small in comparison to the lavish surroundings, her voice almost fragile, but within it beat the undeniable rhythm of resilience. He leaned forward in his chair, elbows resting on his knees, eyes narrowing not with cruelty but with a curiosity that felt unfamiliar to him. For a moment, his polished armor cracked. He remarked quietly on her strength, on how she bore the weight of her world without bitterness, how her endurance seemed more valuable than any of the treasures surrounding them. The maid froze, unsure how to respond. Was this praise genuine, or was it some passing observation born out of boredom? She dared not look too long into his eyes, fearing what she might see there. And just as swiftly as the softness had appeared, his expression hardened again. The fleeting humanity slipped from his face, replaced once more by the mask of control and distance. She returned to her work, but her mind lingered on the strangeness of the moment. Outside, the first drops of rain began to streak down the glass windows, distorting the world beyond into blurred shapes of gray and silver. Inside, the mansion absorbed the tension between them like a sponge. She dusted the bookshelves in the corner, her fingers brushing over volumes bound in leather, volumes whose knowledge would never belong to her. With every swipe of the cloth, she felt the sharp edge of contrast, her rough, tired hands against the polished symbols of wealth and power. The millionaire lit a cigar, the flame briefly illuminating his face with a soft glow. The smoke curled upward, twisting like silent whispers into the air, blurring the sharp edges of the room. He watched her work as though studying a puzzle he could not solve. Why had he asked her those questions? Why had he allowed himself to acknowledge her story? His gaze followed her, but his thoughts seemed caught between curiosity and denial. The maid sensed the weight of his eyes upon her, and yet she refused to falter. She moved with determination, though her heart pounded with unease. She had spoken more than she ever intended, revealed cracks in the wall she built around her vulnerability. And now she wondered if those words would be used against her, or if perhaps they had carved a new, invisible thread connecting two worlds that should never have touched. The clock ticked louder in her ears as she finished the last corner of the room. Time itself seemed to mock her, reminding her that for him, hours were filled with leisure and power, while for her, minutes stretched into exhaustion and survival. She gazed briefly at the window again, watching the storm grow stronger, lightning splitting the sky in the distance. The storm outside mirrored the storm within her, the clash of pride and humility, fear and curiosity, struggle and fleeting recognition. Would you, standing in her place, surrounded by such overwhelming wealth yet carrying the burden of a world The rain had settled into a steady rhythm, tapping against the tall windows of the mansion like 1,000 quiet knocks. Inside, the air grew heavy with the damp scent of the storm, mixing with the faint traces of cigar smoke that lingered from earlier. The maid had moved on to the grand dining room, where a long, polished table stretched endlessly under the glow of a chandelier. Each chair was carved with ornate precision, and each piece of silverware gleamed as though it had never been touched by human hands. She worked silently, arranging utensils, polishing glasses, and adjusting the folds of embroidered napkins until everything reflected perfection. Yet no matter how flawless the table appeared, she knew no seat at that table would ever be hers. As she stepped back to examine her work, her reflection appeared again in the glass of a wine cabinet, faint and blurred, almost ghost-like. She studied it for a moment, noticing how her plain uniform clung slightly to her arms from the sweat of labor, her hair tied back loosely, strands escaping to frame her tired face. In a world of satin gowns and glittering jewelry, her reflection was a reminder of her place, a servant of luxury, but never part of it. The millionaire entered the dining room quietly, his footsteps barely audible on the polished wooden floor. He wore a different suit now, darker, sharper, as though tailored not for comfort but for command. He observed the table with the critical eye of someone accustomed to perfection, yet his gaze did not rest on the plates or glasses. Instead, it lingered on the maid, who straightened nervously under his silent scrutiny. For a moment, the distance between them was more than social. It was palpable, like an invisible wall constructed from years of privilege on one side and years of survival on the other. He broke the silence by asking if she ever dreamed of sitting at such a table, of being served instead of serving. The question hung in the air like lightning waiting to strike. She hesitated, her cloth frozen in mid-motion, and her mind spun with answers she dared not speak. To admit she dreamed of such things would be to reveal longing, to expose a weakness. To deny it would feel dishonest, because who among the poor did not, at some point, imagine a life free from struggle? She answered softly, her voice carrying both truth and restraint. Yes, she had imagined it, but dreams like that were dangerous, better locked away where they could not wound her further. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in judgment, but in something closer to intrigue. He asked her why she thought those dreams were dangerous. Her reply came with the quiet strength of someone who had lived through disappointment too many times. Because when you dream of something unreachable, the waking world becomes sharper, colder. Reality punishes those who hope too brightly. She continued arranging the table as she spoke, her hands steady though her heart trembled at the boldness of her words. The millionaire said nothing at first, his silence stretching into the corners of the room. He tapped his fingers lightly against the back of a chair, lost in thought. Perhaps he had never considered how dangerous hope could be for those without power. For him, dreams were goals to be conquered. For her, they were fragile illusions that only deepened her suffering when they crumbled. The storm outside rumbled louder, thunder shaking the windows for a brief moment. The maid glanced at the flashes of light beyond the glass, the storm painting shadows across the walls. It felt as though nature itself was echoing the tension within the room. She continued her work, polishing a final glass until it gleamed like liquid crystal. Yet even as her hands moved with practiced precision, her mind replayed the unusual conversation. Why did he care what she dreamed? Why did her words seem to affect him? She felt his eyes on her again, sharp and unrelenting, as though he was trying to decipher a puzzle. Perhaps, she wondered, he saw in her something he had forgotten existed. Humility, endurance, or maybe even courage. The thought unsettled her, because it suggested a bond, however small, that should not exist between them. When the clock in the hallway struck the hour, the sound reverberated like a reminder of time's indifference. The maid placed the last glass down and stepped back from the table, her task complete. She looked at the arrangement, an illusion of perfection, ready for guests who would never know the effort behind it. She wondered briefly what it would feel like to sit there, to be surrounded by laughter and abundance instead of fatigue and silence. The thought was quickly buried under the weight of reality. The millionaire finally spoke again, his voice quieter than before. He told her that sometimes people born into privilege did not appreciate the lives they lived. They took comfort, abundance, and security for granted, blind to the struggles of those who served them. She paused, unsure if this was confession or observation. Was he speaking of himself or simply musing aloud? She dared not ask. The storm deepened outside and the lights in the room flickered briefly. For an instant, the chandelier's glow dimmed, plunging the space into near darkness before the electricity steadied again. The brief darkness felt symbolic, like a glimpse into a world stripped of all wealth and pretense. In that shadowed moment, they were just two human beings, one rich, one poor, separated by circumstance yet bound by the fragile thread of existence. The maid gathered her cleaning supplies, her movements quiet but deliberate. Her heart still raced from the conversation, though her face betrayed nothing. She had grown skilled at hiding her emotions, at masking vulnerability beneath layers of composure. Yet inside, questions clawed at her. Why did he speak to her this way, and what did it mean for the days to come? As she left the dining room, the echo of her footsteps trailed behind her like a whisper. The millionaire remained, standing at the head of the long table, his gaze fixed on the empty seats. For all his wealth, the table stretched endlessly before him, vast and hollow, as though mocking the solitude that wealth could not erase. And for you watching this moment unfold, consider this. If you had stood at that table, faced with the contrast of unimaginable wealth and the quiet courage of the storm outside had grown relentless, the steady rhythm of rain now replaced by pounding sheets of water that rattled the tall windows of the mansion. Each crack of thunder seemed to shake the walls, and the lightning split the sky with a brilliance that poured shadows across the opulent hallways. Inside, the air carried a weight of anticipation, as though the storm had seeped into the very foundation of the house. The maid moved through the corridors with her cleaning cart, her footsteps muffled by thick Persian rugs. She paused every so often to adjust a vase, dust a ledge, or wipe away faint streaks on the polished wood. Yet her mind was not on the tasks at hand. It lingered stubbornly on the conversations of earlier, replaying every question, every observation the millionaire had made about her life. She wondered why he had spoken to her at all. In all her years of service in wealthy households, she had grown used to being invisible. The rich rarely looked at her, let alone asked her to share her struggles. Her life was meant to be background noise. Her presence felt only in the gleam of clean floors or the sparkle of freshly polished silver. But here, in this vast mansion filled with silence and echoes, she had been seen in a way that unsettled her deeply. It left her feeling both exposed and strangely acknowledged. The storm pressed harder against the windows as she entered the library, a room that smelled of leather, ink, and time. Towering shelves lined the walls, filled with books she would never read, stories she would never have the leisure to explore. She trailed her fingers briefly along the spines, feeling the richness of their bindings. In another life, she thought, she might have loved books, might have studied, might have built dreams out of words. But that life was not hers. Her hands were destined for scrubbing, her body for labor, her dreams for silence. As she dusted the heavy oak desk, she noticed a single photograph in a silver frame. It was of the millionaire as a younger man, standing beside a woman in a silk dress, both smiling, both radiant with the sheen of privilege. Their happiness looked staged, the kind that belonged more to appearances than to truth. The maid wondered who the woman was, wife, partner, or perhaps someone who had left this place long ago. The photo stirred something in her, a reminder that even in lives wrapped in wealth, there were always cracks unseen from the outside. The door creaked open, and once again the millionaire appeared. His presence filled the library like an unspoken command. He moved to the shelves, pulling out a book at random, flipping its pages without truly reading. The maid kept her eyes on her work, but she could feel him there, his attention darting between the pages and her movements. He asked her suddenly if she believed people were defined by where they were born, or if they could choose who they became. The question startled her, though she tried not to show it. She thought of her childhood in cramped rooms with peeling paint, of nights when hunger gnawed at her, of the endless grind that shaped her into the woman she was now. Could she have chosen differently? Was there ever truly a choice for someone born in poverty? She whispered, more to herself than to him, that the world did not grant the poor the same choices it gave the rich. For some, the path was paved in gold. For others, it was broken glass. The millionaire listened, his expression unreadable. He closed the book without marking the page and set it back on the shelf. His gaze lingered on her longer than usual, as though searching for answers in her face. She avoided his eyes, fearing what he might see there. Fear, strength, longing, or all of them tangled together. The thunder boomed again, shaking the windows, and the chandelier trembled slightly overhead. For a brief moment, the library felt like a fragile sanctuary, vulnerable to the rage of the storm outside. The maid's hands shook as she arranged the books on the desk, though she forced her body to appear calm. Inside, however, she battled with the strange reality she found herself in. The world's barriers of wealth and poverty suddenly felt thinner, as though a conversation could blur centuries of division. She thought about how dangerous this could be. For him, perhaps nothing more than curiosity, but for her, everything. If she allowed herself to believe that his attention meant something, if she let herself imagine a bond, the pain of disappointment would be unbearable. And yet, despite her warnings to herself, she felt the faint stirrings of something fragile, a recognition that he saw her as more than a shadow. When she finished her work in the library, she gathered her supplies and prepared to leave, but the storm made her pause at the doorway. The rain lashed against the glass, blurring the outside world into streaks of gray. She turned back for one last glance at the room, at the millionaire standing by the shelves, deep in thought. He looked less like a master of the house and more like a prisoner of it, surrounded by wealth yet untouched by warmth. The maid closed the door quietly behind her and walked down the long hallway. The ticking of the clock echoed through the corridor, a reminder that time marched forward regardless of wealth or poverty. She carried with her not just the weight of her duties, but the heaviness of questions she could not answer. Why was he interested in her thoughts? What did he hope to gain by peeling back the layers of her life? The storm showed no sign of ending, and within its chaos, the mansion seemed to breathe differently. Shadows stretched across the walls, and the air felt charged, alive with possibilities both dangerous and profound. The maid reached the staircase and paused, her hand resting on the railing she had polished countless times. She stared upward at the grand chandelier glowing faintly above, then downward at her cracked hands gripping the polished wood. The contrast struck her again, luxury and struggle, power and survival, two worlds colliding silently within the same walls. And as you witness her climb the stairs, carrying not only her cleaning supplies but the unspoken weight of their strange connection, ask yourself this. If you were in her place, would you shield your heart to protect yourself from disappointment? Or would you risk the pain of believing that even across the chasm? The evening descended slowly over the mansion, painting the sky in shades of crimson and violet as the sun surrendered to the horizon. The city lights flickered to life in the distance, but here, surrounded by sprawling gardens and tall iron gates, the world felt sealed away, untouched by noise and movement. Inside, the air was dense with quiet anticipation, as though the walls themselves were waiting to witness what would unfold next. The maid, exhausted from a long day of endless scrubbing and polishing, carried her last load of laundry through the narrow service hallway. Her steps were heavy, her back sore, but her mind even heavier. The memory of the millionaire's questions earlier still lingered in her thoughts, like an echo she could not silence. His interest in her story unsettled her. People like him never asked about people like her. She belonged to a life of shadows, unseen, unimportant, her existence measured only by the shine she left behind on someone else's surfaces. And yet he had asked, and she had answered, and now she could not shake the feeling that something had shifted. She entered the master bedroom, one of the grandest spaces in the mansion. The walls were covered in silk wallpaper, the bed draped with layers of velvet, the floor softened by Persian rugs so thick her footsteps vanished in them. She placed the folded clothes on a chair, careful not to disturb the order of things. Every detail mattered in this house. A wrinkle, a speck of dust, a curtain slightly out of place could mean disapproval, and disapproval carried consequences. As she moved toward the windows to close the heavy drapes, she caught sight of her reflection in the glass. For a brief moment, the faint light of the chandelier behind her framed her figure, and she saw herself against the grandeur of the room. A maid standing in a palace, her reflection a reminder of the distance between who she was and where she stood. She lowered her eyes quickly, ashamed of her own imagination. She was not part of this world, only a shadow moving through it. The sound of footsteps broke her thoughts. She turned, startled, to find the millionaire standing at the doorway. He was not in his usual tailored suit, but in a more casual shirt, though even that carried an elegance she could never reach. His presence filled the room effortlessly, as though it were designed for him alone. He stepped inside, his gaze steady, his silence carrying more weight than words could. She froze, unsure of what to do. Should she leave? Should she bow her head and excuse herself? But he did not seem to want her gone. He walked to the window she had just closed, pulling the curtain slightly aside to glance at the darkening sky. For a long moment, neither spoke, and the silence felt heavy with something unspoken, something fragile yet undeniable. Finally, he asked her another question, not about her duties, not about the mansion, but about her life beyond these walls. Did she have dreams? Did she imagine a different future? His voice was calm, steady, but his eyes seemed to search for something deeper. She hesitated, her hands tightening around the cloth she still held. No one had ever asked her about her dreams before. Dreams were luxuries for people who had choices. For her, there had only been survival. Yet in that moment, under his gaze, she found herself speaking again. She told him of the books she once borrowed from neighbors when she was a child, the way she would read by candlelight until her eyes ached, the stories that carried her far from the poverty she knew. She told him how she once wanted to study, to become a teacher, to guide children toward the very hope she clung to in those pages. But life had taken her elsewhere. Her parents fell ill, her siblings needed care, and the weight of survival crushed the fragile wings of her dreams. The words spilled out before she could stop them, filling the grand room with a story that did not belong there. She felt exposed, vulnerable, as though every flaw in her life was now displayed in the golden light of the chandelier. But he listened, and his silence was not empty. It was attentive, almost reverent, as if her story carried value in his eyes. When she finally stopped speaking, shame washed over her. She lowered her gaze, waiting for the dismissive smile, the polite nod, the inevitable reminder that their worlds could never mix. But none of that came. Instead, there was only silence, and then a quiet acknowledgement that left her unsettled. He told her that he understood. That single phrase lingered in the air, as strange and impossible as if the moon itself had descended into the room. The maid felt a rush of conflicting emotions. Gratitude for being heard, fear of what it meant, and confusion over why he, of all people, would care. She wanted to leave to escape the intensity of the moment, but her legs felt rooted to the ground. The air between them was heavy, charged with something neither dared name. The clock on the wall ticked, each second dragging slowly, amplifying the tension that wrapped around them. She finally forced herself to turn away, her duties giving her the excuse she desperately needed. She gathered the folded clothes and carried them out, her steps unsteady, her heart racing. The mansion's corridors felt longer than usual, their silence pressing against her like a question she could not answer. That night, as she lay in her small room tucked away in the servants' quarters, she could not sleep. The words replayed in her mind, The way he had looked at her, the strange softness in his voice when he asked about her dreams. She had lived so long in a world where no one cared about her story, where her worth was measured only by the cleanliness of a floor or the shine of silverware. And now one conversation had unsettled everything. In the darkness, she wondered what it meant. Was it pity, curiosity, or something else entirely, something she dared not name? She turned on her side, clutching the thin blanket to her chest, her thoughts restless. The mansion was silent, but inside her a storm had begun, one that would not quiet easily. And so the night passed, with questions hanging heavy in the air, unspoken yet undeniable. The fragile balance between two worlds had shifted, and neither of them could return to the way things were before. Now consider this moment. If you were the maid, burdened by a lifetime of invisibility, and suddenly someone from a world of power and wealth asked you about your dreams, would you dare to answer honestly? The following morning arrived with a pale gray sky, heavy clouds covering the sun, casting the entire estate in a muted, somber light. The mansion, usually glowing with polished marble and glistening chandeliers, appeared subdued, almost brooding. For the maid, the day began as it always did, with the familiar rhythm of her duties. She carried buckets, polished silver, straightened cushions, and dusted endless shelves of objects that belonged to a world so far removed from her own. Yet, despite the repetition of her routine, her mind refused to settle. The conversation from the previous night haunted her like a shadow clinging to her every step. She tried to focus on her work, scrubbing harder than necessary, forcing herself into the physicality of the task, as if it could erase the memory of the millionaire's voice and the strange weight in his gaze. But each polished surface reflected not just her face, but the unshakable truth that something had shifted. She was no longer invisible, not entirely. That thought alone unsettled her, for invisibility had always been her shield. To be unseen was to be safe. To be noticed was to risk exposure, judgment, and disappointment. As she moved through the grand halls, she passed portraits of stern-faced ancestors, men in tailored coats and women adorned with jewels, their eyes painted to follow intruders through the room. These walls had been built to enshrine power, to declare permanence, to remind everyone who entered that this family's wealth was more than material. It was history, legacy, control. She felt like an intruder here, her plain uniform and weary face a silent contradiction to the gilded frames and velvet curtains. Later that day, she was summoned to help prepare the grand dining room. A dinner was scheduled, one that would host influential guests, men of business, women of influence, people whose conversations determined the fate of ventures worth more than she could ever imagine. The staff worked quickly, polishing the long mahogany table, setting crystal glasses that sparkled like captured light, and arranging silverware with the precision of soldiers in formation. She kept her head low, her movements practiced and efficient, but she felt his presence before she saw him. The millionaire entered the room, inspecting the arrangements with his usual meticulousness. His voice carried calm authority as he gave instructions, though he barely raised it. Everyone obeyed without hesitation, a subtle reminder of his control over not just the house but the people within it. For a moment their eyes met across the room. It was brief, so quick it could have been imagined, but it carried weight nonetheless. She looked away instantly, her heart tightening in her chest. She told herself it was nothing, just a trick of her restless thoughts. Yet when she bent over to adjust a napkin, she could still feel the burn of his gaze. The dinner came, and with it, the usual spectacle. Guests arrived in sleek cars, dressed in tailored suits and glittering gowns. Their laughter echoed through the grand entrance hall as they exchanged pleasantries, their words layered with hidden intentions and subtle games of power. The maid moved quietly through the scene, her presence unnoticed. As always, though her ears caught fragments of conversations about investments, scandals, and ambitions that stretched far beyond her comprehension. From the shadows of the dining room, she observed him, sitting at the head of the table, perfectly poised, commanding attention without effort. He laughed at the right moments, listened intently when others spoke, and offered opinions with the authority of someone used to being obeyed. To his guests, he was untouchable, the embodiment of wealth and influence. To her, he was the man who had asked about her dreams. The contrast was overwhelming. How could the same man who sat like a king at this table, surrounded by opulence and power, have shown even a flicker of interest in the life of a maid? She tried to push the thought aside, focusing instead on carrying trays, refilling glasses, and clearing plates. But every time she passed near him, she felt the same weight in the air, a presence that made it difficult to breathe. As the evening wore on, she retreated briefly to the kitchen, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the counter. The laughter and clinking glasses from the dining room felt like echoes from another world, a world she could observe but never belong to. She tried to remind herself of her place. She was here to serve, nothing more. Any illusion of significance was dangerous, a path that led only to pain. And yet, when the dinner ended and the guests began to leave, she found herself lingering near the doorway, her eyes unconsciously seeking him out. He was bidding farewell to his guests, shaking hands, offering polite smiles. But when his eyes landed on her just for a second, his expression shifted. There was no dismissal in his gaze, no condescension. Instead, there was acknowledgement, subtle but undeniable, as though she were more than just another shadow in his house. She turned away quickly, her heart racing, ashamed of the rush of warmth that rose in her chest. She told herself it meant nothing, that she was imagining it. But deep down, she knew she was not. Something was happening, something she could neither name nor control. That night, lying in her small room once again, she could not silence her thoughts. She replayed every glance, every word, every silence heavy with meaning. The mansion's walls seemed to close in around her, suffocating her with the weight of what was unspoken. She clutched her blanket tightly, torn between fear and longing, between the safety of invisibility and the danger of being seen. For years, she had built her life around survival, around remaining unnoticed and unremarkable. But now, the gaze of one man had cracked the foundation of that existence. The question that lingered in her heart was not whether she wanted more, but whether she dared to reach for it. Now imagine yourself in her place, surrounded by wealth you can never possess, noticed by someone who stands in a world untouchable to you. Would you choose to embrace that acknowledgement, fragile and uncertain as it is? Or would you retreat into the safety of shadows, protecting yourself from a longing that could never be fulfilled? The following days passed in a blur of routine, yet the air inside the mansion carried a tension that could not be ignored. The maid went about her duties with the same precision as always, yet her movements felt heavier, slower, as though every step she took dragged the weight of her thoughts behind her. She tried to convince herself that nothing had changed, that she was simply a worker in a grand house, invisible as always. But she could not forget the look in his eyes, nor the questions that had stripped away the armor she had built over years of silence. The mansion itself seemed to conspire against her attempts at forgetting. Every corridor reminded her of his presence. Every polished surface reflected fragments of her face, alongside the wealth she could never touch. Even the grand staircase, with its sweeping red carpet and golden banister, felt like a stage on which she played a role too small to matter, while he stood at the center of everything. One evening, as the staff hurried to prepare for yet another gathering, she found herself assigned to arrange the library. It was one of the few rooms in the house where she felt a strange comfort. Rows upon rows of books lined the walls, their leather spines carrying the scent of history and wisdom. She often imagined herself pulling one from the shelf, sinking into the plush armchair in the corner, and losing herself in its pages. But of course, she never dared. The books were not for her. She was dusting the shelves when she heard the door open. She froze, cloth in hand, as he entered the room. The millionaire walked with the calm confidence that always seemed to command the space around him. He glanced at the shelves, then at her, and for a moment, silence hung between them, heavy and charged. He asked her what she thought of the library, if she liked books. The question caught her off guard. She lowered her eyes, murmuring a simple acknowledgement, but he pressed gently, curious. Something in his tone carried no judgment, only genuine interest. She admitted hesitantly that she had loved books since she was a child, that stories had been her escape from the harshness of reality. Her voice trembled as she spoke, for it felt dangerous to reveal so much. Yet once again, the words flowed as if they had been waiting years to be heard. He listened, standing close enough that she could feel the weight of his presence. He asked what kinds of stories she liked most, and she found herself describing tales of resilience, of people rising from nothing to find their place in the world. As she spoke, her eyes lifted to the shelves, and for a brief, fleeting moment, she allowed herself to imagine that she belonged in this room, not as a servant, but as someone free to reach for any story she desired. The moment was broken by the sound of voices in the hallway. She stepped back quickly, her face flushing with shame at her own boldness. He gave her a look, calm, unreadable, but not dismissive, before turning toward the door. Without another word, he left, and she was once again alone with the silence of the library. But her heart raced, her hands trembling as she returned to her work. That night, she could not sleep. The memory of the conversation replayed in her mind, each word amplified by the loneliness of her small room. She wondered why he kept asking, why he cared at all. Was it pity, amusement, or something else, something she dared not name? The following morning, the mansion stirred with activity once more. The millionaire had meetings scheduled, important business that kept the household bustling with preparations. She caught glimpses of him as she moved through the house, standing in the grand hall, giving instructions with quiet authority, his face calm but commanding. To everyone else, he was the untouchable figure at the center of power, the man whose words shaped the lives of many. But to her, he was also the man who had asked about her dreams in the quiet of the night, the man who had stood in the library and listened without judgment. The contrast tore at her. She wanted to bury the thoughts, to retreat back into invisibility, but something inside her resisted. For years, she had silenced her own voice, convinced that no one wanted to hear it. Now, every question he asked seemed to breathe life into that voice again, fragile yet insistent. Later that day, while cleaning the dining room after a hurried lunch, she overheard a conversation between two of the other staff members. They whispered about the millionaire, about his wealth, his influence, and the women who sought his attention. Their words carried envy and curiosity, painting him as untouchable, a figure who lived beyond the reach of ordinary lives. She said nothing, her hands busy with plates and glasses, but inside her chest tightened. They spoke of him as though he were another world entirely, and perhaps he was. What unsettled her most was that he had reached across that distance, if only for a moment, and she had let herself respond. The mansion grew quiet in the evening. As she moved through the halls, she paused near the large windows overlooking the garden. The sky outside was heavy with clouds, a faint drizzle falling over the perfectly trimmed hedges and marble statues. She pressed her hand lightly against the glass, the coolness grounding her as her thoughts spun. Why did his questions matter so much? Why did they linger long after the words had faded? She told herself it was nothing, that she was fooling herself, but deep down, she knew the truth. In a life where she had been invisible for so long, even the smallest acknowledgement carried the weight of a miracle. The night ended as it always did, with her retreating to her small room. She lay awake, listening to the faint hum of the rain against the window, her mind restless. The mansion seemed to sleep peacefully, its wealth secure, its silence absolute. But within her, something stirred, fragile yet unstoppable. And so the days stretched onward, with her caught between two worlds, the one she belonged to and the one that seemed to reach out to her in fleeting, impossible moments. She knew the danger of hope, the pain of longing, and yet she could not help but wonder what it all meant. Now imagine yourself in her place. If you were surrounded daily by symbols of wealth and power, invisible to those who lived within them, and suddenly one of those figures began to notice you. Not your work, but your voice, your story. Would you see it as a gift, a chance to be seen at last? Or would you fear it as a cruel illusion, one that could shatter your fragile existence the moment you reached for it? The mansion awoke that morning under a golden haze. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, catching on the crystal chandeliers and scattering fragments of light across the polished marble floors. To anyone entering for the first time, it might have looked like a palace bathed in warmth and grandeur. But for the maid, the brightness only sharpened the contrast between her world and theirs. The rays of the sun revealed every smudge, every speck of dust, every imperfection she was expected to erase. Her hands were raw from days of labor, her back stiff from endless bending and lifting, yet she carried on with the same discipline that had become her armor. Each task was familiar, each movement ingrained in muscle memory. But beneath that practiced surface, her mind churned, restless, circling around questions she could not escape. Why had he continued to notice her? Why had he asked questions that no one else cared to ask? And why, despite her fear, did she keep answering? She was cleaning the ornate railing of the grand staircase when the sound of voices drifted up from the hall below. Guests had arrived earlier than expected. She leaned slightly over the rail, careful not to be seen, and observed as the millionaire greeted two men in tailored suits. Their words were low but sharp, laced with tension. They spoke of investments, markets, and risks that carried stakes she could barely imagine. But what caught her attention was not their conversation. It was the way he carried himself. Calm, composed, every gesture deliberate. To them, he was a pillar of power, a man whose decisions commanded respect. To her, he was also the man who had stood in the library and listened to her speak of dreams she thought long buried. The day unfolded in a flurry of preparations. The staff rushed to accommodate the unexpected meeting, moving with precision to ensure the men had everything they needed. She was sent to the garden to arrange the outdoor terrace for refreshments. As she carried trays laden with crystal glasses, she felt the weight of his presence when he appeared at the doorway. He did not speak, not at first, but his gaze lingered, steady, unreadable. When their eyes met, her chest tightened, her hands trembling just slightly as she set the glasses down. He asked her then softly whether she ever walked in the garden for herself. The question startled her. She shook her head, murmuring that it was not her place. The gardens, with their marble fountains and roses trimmed into perfect shapes, belonged to the family and their guests, not to her. But his eyes did not waver, as if he were silently disagreeing. Before she could say more, the men called him back, and just like that, the moment dissolved. Yet the question lingered like an echo in her mind, refusing to fade. Later, as dusk painted the sky in shades of amber and violet, the mansion grew quieter. The guests had left, and the staff retreated to their quarters, but she remained in the garden, finishing her duties. The roses glowed faintly in the fading light, their petals delicate yet defiant against the cooling air. She paused, her hands resting on the handle of the watering can, and for the first time allowed herself to breathe in the beauty around her. The garden was silent except for the trickle of the fountain, and in that silence she felt both small and strangely alive. She did not hear him approach until he spoke. His voice was calm, softer than usual, carrying none of the authority he displayed in the presence of others. He asked her what she thought of the garden. Slowly, hesitantly, she admitted that it was beautiful, though she had never seen it as hers to enjoy. He stepped closer, his gaze fixed on the fountain, and remarked that beauty meant nothing if it was never shared. His words unsettled her. She wanted to believe them, yet she knew the truth of her world. Beauty, wealth, power, these were not things meant for her. She was a shadow, a servant, her existence confined to labor. And yet, as he stood beside her in the quiet garden, his presence seemed to challenge that truth. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken thoughts. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of roses and damp earth. She felt her heart racing, each beat loud against the stillness of the evening. She told herself to step away, to retreat before the moment grew dangerous. But her legs refused to move. For reasons she could not explain, she wanted to stay, to listen, to believe that his words carried meaning beyond politeness. At last, she gathered her courage to speak. She confessed that when she was younger, she used to imagine gardens like this one, not because she expected to see them, but because they lived in the stories she read. In books, gardens were places of transformation, where characters discovered truths about themselves, where hidden feelings came to light. Her voice faltered as she realized the vulnerability in her words, but it was too late to take them back. He turned to her then, his expression unreadable yet intent. For a moment, she thought she had said too much, exposed herself more than she should have. But instead of dismissal, there was acknowledgement in his gaze, a quiet recognition that unsettled her even more than rejection would have. The moment stretched until the sound of footsteps from inside the mansion broke the fragile silence. She stepped back quickly, her face flushing with shame, and murmured something about finishing her work. He nodded once, his face returning to the calm mask he wore so easily. And then he walked away, leaving her alone with the roses and the lingering echo of their words. That night, as she lay in her small room, sleep eluded her once again. The image of the garden burned in her mind, the glow of twilight, the scent of roses, the weight of his presence beside her. She told herself it meant nothing, that she was foolish to give it meaning. But no matter how many times she repeated it, the feeling refused to fade. The lines between her world and his were blurring, not in reality, but in her heart. And that was the most dangerous place of all. Now place yourself in her position. Surrounded by beauty that was never meant for you, suddenly invited, even subtly, to see it as your own, would you accept the invitation? Or would you retreat into the safety of believing it was never yours to begin with? The morning light seeped through the tall windows of the mansion, softer now, diffused by the early fog rolling in from the distant hills. The mansion itself seemed quieter, less imposing, almost intimate in a way it had never been before. The maid moved through the hallways with a measured rhythm, her mind preoccupied with the events of the last weeks. It had been months since the chaos began, since lies and betrayal had threatened the fragile balance of their lives. Yet every corner of the mansion carried echoes of the past, moments she wished she could forget, reminders of the fear and humiliation she had endured, and the weight of a child's life she had fought to save. She paused at the door of the nursery, peeking inside at the child who had become the center of her universe. Miguel was playing quietly on the floor, building towers with blocks, his small hands precise and deliberate. There was a concentration in his eyes that mirrored her own when she was absorbed in her tasks. He looked up suddenly, his gaze landing on her with a brightness that made her heart ache in ways words could not capture. She knelt beside him, helping him stack the blocks, feeling the ease of the moment slip past her defenses. This was why she endured everything. The moments like these, unguarded and pure, where love and care mattered more than wealth, power, or the opinions of outsiders. Gabriel appeared then, silently watching from the doorway. His expression was softer than she had ever seen, a mixture of admiration and caution. He did not intrude, did not speak, but she felt the weight of his presence beside her. It was strange, this tension between them. Not romance, not yet, but a tether forged in shared responsibility, in mutual understanding, and the quiet acknowledgement of mistakes past. For her, it was a reminder that even in worlds divided by wealth and status, human connection could still exist, tentative but undeniable. The day unfolded with routines, yet beneath them lay subtle shifts. Conversations grew longer, touches more natural, the small gestures of family slowly knitting together bonds that had been fractured. The mansion, once a fortress of solitude for Gabriel, began to feel more like a home. Meals were shared in a less formal, more relaxed way. Miguel laughed freely, his voice a melody that seemed to brighten the heavy chandeliers. She noticed how Gabriel adjusted to her presence, stepping lightly around her in the kitchen, offering small courtesies that were unfamiliar but appreciated. She acknowledged them with a nod, a brief smile, but her walls remained protective and necessary. Trust was not rebuilt overnight. By late afternoon, news from the outside world began to intrude. A delivery arrived, and with it, letters and notes from neighbors and acquaintances. They were curious, sometimes judgmental, sometimes admiring. She glanced at the words, feeling the mixture of relief and apprehension. People were noticing the changes, seeing that the child was thriving, that the house no longer carried the oppressive weight of previous suspicion and gossip. Gabriel took the letters from her hand, scanning them quickly, his jaw tightening at the ones that reflected doubt and scorn. It was a world that could never fully understand the bond between her and Miguel, but at least some were beginning to see the truth. As evening approached, the air cooled and the long shadows stretched across the marble floors. She found herself once again in the garden, tending to the small blooms that had survived despite neglect. The work was grounding, a reminder that life continued outside of wealth and intrigue, a world of tangible effort and reward. Gabriel joined her after a moment, carrying a small tray with 2 cups of tea. He did not speak at first, simply handing her a cup. She accepted it with a cautious nod, feeling the warmth spread through her hands, the faint scent of chamomile mingling with the garden's earthy aroma. It was a simple gesture, but for both of them it carried meaning beyond words. They stood together in silence, watching the fading light, listening to the distant hum of the city, the rustle of leaves, the occasional chirp of a bird. The garden was no longer just a task to be managed, but a place of reflection, of thought, of quiet understanding. She spoke then, her voice low, almost hesitant about the weeks past, about how fragile trust could be and how easily it could be broken. Gabriel listened, his eyes fixed on hers, absorbing every word, not interrupting, not defending, simply listening. There was a power in that silence, a reassurance that she could speak without judgment, that her voice mattered. Later, as night fell, Miguel called from the nursery, and they moved together to respond. The little boy clung to her as she lifted him, his weight light but his presence heavy with the affection he demanded. Gabriel watched them, his thoughts tangled in gratitude and guilt, the realization of how easily mistakes could alter lives. He had been reckless once, led by assumptions and the manipulations of others. Now, faced with the tangible results of her courage and care, he understood the depth of his errors and the responsibility he bore. This was not just about forgiveness. It was about action, about being present, about ensuring safety and love in a world that could be cruel and indifferent. The evening continued with quiet domesticity. Dinner was prepared together, the three of them moving through the kitchen with an unfamiliar rhythm. Laughter spilling quietly from Miguel as he tested his newly learned words, naming colors, animals, and shapes. For a moment, the mansion felt alive in a way it had never been, resonant with connection rather than isolation. She saw him then, Gabriel, genuinely engaged, learning to see beyond the exterior, to participate in the life that revolved around care, responsibility, and shared effort. It was a revelation, not just for him but for her, a glimpse of a future where roles were defined not by wealth or status but by commitment and love. Later, as the night deepened, she found herself alone in her room, reflecting on the changes. She thought about the challenges ahead, the whispers that would continue, the skepticism of those who could not see beyond appearances, the ongoing work of rebuilding trust. But she also thought about the small victories, the laughter of a child, the moments of genuine respect and acknowledgement from a man who had once doubted her, the quiet satisfaction of a day well spent. It was a balance between hope and caution, optimism and realism, the delicate tightrope of navigating a world divided by social strata yet bound by human connection. She wondered, as she often did, what the next weeks would bring. Would the mansion remain a place of subtle reconciliation, or slip back into the cold isolation that had marked its past? Could trust survive the pressures of outside judgment and internal doubt? Could a bond forged through crisis evolve into something stable, something enduring? The questions were numerous, but there were answers, slowly revealing themselves in moments like these, in laughter, in quiet conversation, in shared effort, in the simple yet profound acts of care. For the first time in months, she felt the stirrings of hope, not naive, not untested, but tempered by experience, by knowledge of human frailty and resilience alike. She understood that the final steps toward harmony were still ahead, that the climax of their story had not yet arrived. There would be trials, challenges, moments of doubt and fear, but she also recognized the possibility of a new beginning. The mansion could become a home, not because of wealth or grandeur, but because of trust earned, love expressed, and the unshakable bond formed between them. She drifted into sleep with Miguel's small voice echoing in her mind, calling her mommy, and the quiet weight of Gabriel's respect and care. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future that was not dictated by circumstance or status, but shaped by choices, commitment, and the courage to care deeply despite risk. She felt ready, prepared for the final steps, the ultimate resolution, knowing that what awaited in the next chapter could transform all their lives forever. As the night settled over the mansion, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying promises of change, of reconciliation, of the possibility that the chaos of the past could be tempered into a lasting peace. Outside, the world remained indifferent, as it always had, but inside, a story of human resilience, compassion, and courage was quietly reaching its zenith, preparing for the final act that would bring closure, healing, and the unmistakable warmth of a family forged not by blood alone, but by choice, love, and unwavering. The first rays of dawn filtered gently through the grand windows, casting a warm, golden hue across the mansion's expansive halls. The air carried a serenity that had been absent for months, a fragile calm after storms of mistrust, lies, and manipulation. She walked softly down the corridor, her bare feet touching the polished floors, each step a quiet affirmation of how far they had come. In the nursery, Miguel stirred in his crib, his small hands stretching upward, eyes still half-lidded with sleep. She scooped him up, holding him close, feeling the rise and fall of his chest against her own. It was a rhythm she had learned to follow, a silent conversation of trust, protection, and unconditional love. Gabriel appeared in the doorway, a mug of coffee in hand, and paused to watch the scene before him. He was no longer just a distant observer of their lives. He was a participant, a guardian, a parent, a man humbled by mistakes yet committed to redemption. The tension that had once defined their interactions had eased into a delicate balance of respect and partnership. No words were necessary at first. They shared the space in quiet understanding. Miguel babbled happily, his laughter a melody that seemed to bind them together in the room, in the house, and in the slowly healing heart of the family. The day began with the routine tasks of a household, yet there was an unmistakable shift in tone. Breakfast was prepared together, a dance of cooperation and subtle intimacy. The maid's hands moved deftly, chopping fruit and arranging plates, while Gabriel handled the coffee, toast, and gentle encouragements to their child. Miguel ran between them, delighted by the playful exchanges, naming colors, shapes, and animals. For the first time in months, the mansion was alive, not with wealth or power, but with the vibrancy of a real family, imperfect, scarred, yet unbreakably connected. Every glance, every gesture reinforced the bond forged in adversity, in the crucible of past mistakes and present commitment. Later, as sunlight spilled into the garden, she tended to the plants with meticulous care, while Gabriel set up a small play area for Miguel. The contrast of their roles was stark yet natural. The maid's strength in resilience, patience, and quiet determination. The millionaire's strength in resources, adaptation, and the willingness to learn humility. They moved around each other with an unspoken choreography, respect guiding every interaction. The outside world, which had once judged and whispered, now seemed irrelevant, their priorities clear and focused on the child who had become their center. By mid-afternoon, the phone rang. She hesitated, recognizing the number immediately. It was Marcos, the ex-husband who had spread lies and sought to manipulate events. Gabriel answered without hesitation, his voice calm but firm. "Marcos, there's nothing more to discuss. Your claims are false. Leave us to live our lives." The line went dead, and a tension lifted from the room. The confrontation had been avoided physically, yet mentally it was a victory, a declaration that the past would no longer intrude on the present. She felt a quiet sense of satisfaction, the validation that truth and resilience could withstand falsehoods and attempts to undermine them. The evening brought another test, subtle yet unavoidable. The arrival of neighbors and acquaintances curious to witness the new order of the household. They entered with hesitant smiles, whispers of doubt lingering in their eyes. Yet, the sight of Miguel, radiant and healthy, laughing freely under the care of the woman they had once scorned, and the man who had doubted her, spoke louder than words. Conversations unfolded naturally, admiration replacing judgment in some faces, caution softening in others. It was a quiet triumph of integrity, a demonstration that actions spoke far louder than rumors, that care and love were more powerful than envy or misconception. Night descended, and she tucked Miguel into bed, feeling the weight of the day settle into her muscles. Gabriel joined them, sitting on the edge of the crib with a gentle smile. Their hands brushed lightly, a fleeting contact charged with unspoken acknowledgement and shared responsibility. They spoke about the future, not as lovers, not yet, but as partners in care, partners in responsibility, partners in life. Every plan for Miguel's growth, education, and happiness was discussed, ensuring both voices were heard, both perspectives valued. The mansion had transformed, not into a palace of opulence, but into a home of respect, understanding, and emotional safety. As she sat by the window later, reflecting on the journey from chaos to harmony, she realized the depth of their achievements. Trust had been shattered and painstakingly rebuilt. Lies had been exposed and confronted. A child had been nurtured and protected. A family had been formed, not by blood alone, but by courage, dedication, and mutual respect. The narrative of betrayal, humiliation, and doubt had given way to one of redemption, strength, and careful happiness. She knew there would always be scars, moments of doubt, but the foundations laid now were strong, resilient, and enduring. Gabriel approached, carrying Miguel in his arms, his eyes soft with emotion. "It's been a long journey," he said quietly. "We've been tested more than most families ever are." She nodded, feeling the truth in his words. "But we made it through, together." Miguel wriggled, pointing to both of them. "Mommy, Daddy?" The words, spoken with clarity, held a weight of significance far beyond their innocence. They were more than names. They were affirmations of bonds, of safety, of identity within the family. She smiled, tears threatening, yet proud and fulfilled. The mansion, the neighborhood, the world outside, none of it mattered as much as the family they had become. The night progressed with quiet reflection, Gabriel and she sitting together on the terrace, watching the stars emerge, twinkling against the velvet sky. Conversations drifted from small details of the day to dreams for the future, hopes for Miguel, and shared visions of a life defined by love, trust, and commitment. She realized that forgiveness, patience, and resilience were not passive acts but active choices, made daily and deliberately. The arc of their journey had been shaped not by fortune alone, but by the willingness to act rightly despite fear, doubt, or external judgment. As they returned inside, preparing for rest, she felt a completeness, a resolution to the chaos that had once dominated every aspect of their lives. Gabriel's hand brushed hers, and for the first time she allowed herself to truly feel the depth of partnership that had emerged. It was subtle, gentle, real. No grand declarations, no forced romance, simply an acknowledgement of shared strength, shared responsibility, and shared love for the child who had been the catalyst for transformation. Miguel slept peacefully between them, the embodiment of their efforts, courage, and care. Finally, she addressed the lingering question that had haunted them both. The outside world, the whispers, the scrutiny. She knew there would always be those who doubted, who envied, who gossiped. But she also knew the power of truth revealed through action, the credibility built through love and perseverance. Gabriel had learned humility, she had learned resilience, and together they had created a household capable of withstanding external pressures. The mansion, once a symbol of isolation and wealth, now stood as a beacon of stability, care, and earned respect. Before retiring, Gabriel spoke, his voice deliberate, strong, yet tender. "We've done everything we can. The rest is up to life." She nodded, feeling the full weight of what had been accomplished. A chapter had closed and a new one had begun. A chapter defined not by wealth, status, or rumor, but by trust, courage, and family. It was imperfect, real, and deeply human, and it was theirs. As the camera would have framed it if they were part of a cinematic narrative, the final scene was intimate and vivid. Miguel between them, sleeping peacefully, the warm glow of lamps and candles filling the room. Shadows dancing softly against walls lined with books, memories, and small artifacts of daily life. Outside, the wind whispered through trees, promising continuation, resilience, and growth. Inside, hearts beat with love, courage, and the satisfaction of overcoming trials that could have destroyed them. This was more than a happy ending. It was a victory of human connection, of truth over deceit, of love over fear. The mansion had transformed from a place of judgment and isolation to one of nurturing, protection, and enduring hope. And though life would continue to test them, the foundation had been laid, unshakable and strong. If you've been following Mara's incredible journey, from unjust accusations, heartbreak, and homelessness, to courage, redemption, and the ultimate triumph, you know that real stories of resilience and human strength can inspire us all. Imagine being in her shoes. Would you have the strength to face betrayal, protect a child, and rebuild trust? What about Gabriel? Could you overcome prejudice, admit mistakes, and truly learn to care in ways that matter? The lessons here are universal, and the story is far from over. Stay tuned for our next video, where we'll reveal another shocking, emotional, and inspiring story that will capture your heart and challenge your perspective on trust, courage, and the power of human compassion. You won't want to miss it. Subscribe now and be part of the journey as we explore the incredible real-life dramas that define lives, change hearts,